It was a Tuesday morning in February 1969, inside a government building in Moscow, and the most important argument in the history of the Cold War was happening in complete silence, because the man losing it was not allowed to raise his voice in front of the committee. His name was Sergei Alexeyevich Lebedev. He was 61 years old, the greatest computer scientist the Soviet Union had ever produced, and he was watching decades of his life's work get dismantled by bureaucrats who had never once touched a computer. The decision on the table that morning would go down as one of the most catastrophic technological miscalculations of the 20th century, not because of what it destroyed, but because of what it chose instead. The Soviet Union had a genuine chance to win the computer race. They had the engineers, they had the mathematics, they had the funding. And in 1969, facing the United States at the peak of the space race, they chose to surrender the future of computing without firing a single shot. What happened in that meeting room, and in the secret laboratories and political corridors that followed, is a story that has never been told the way it actually unfolded. Because the real story isn't about technology, it's about what happens when ideology is more important than truth, and the price an entire civilization pays when it cannot admit that someone else built something better. To understand what was lost in 1969, you have to go back to 1950. In a converted church building on the outskirts of Kyiv, in a country still bleeding from the Second World War, Sergei Lebedev and a team of exhausted engineers working 18-hour days completed the first electronic stored program computer ever built on the European continent. They called it the MESM, the Small Electronic Calculating Machine. It wasn't small. It filled an entire room with 6,000 vacuum tubes and could perform 3,000 operations per second. But it worked. And in 1950, very few things like it worked anywhere in the world. The Americans had the ENIAC, the British had the Manchester Baby, and the Soviets, a country the Western world assumed was technologically primitive, still rebuilding from a war that had killed 27 million of its citizens, had the MESM, not copied from anyone, not reverse engineered, built from first principles by mathematicians who had survived the siege of Leningrad and the purges of Stalin, who did their calculations by hand in frozen offices because there wasn't always enough electricity to do otherwise. Lebedev understood something in 1950 that most Western analysts would not admit until much later. The Soviets were not behind in computing. They were different. They approached the architecture of machines from a distinct mathematical tradition, one rooted in the Soviet school of cybernetics and theoretical mathematics that had been developing independently since the 1930s. Some of their solutions were not inferior to American designs. A few were arguably superior. By 1952, the BESM, the Big Electronic Calculating Machine, was operational in Moscow. At the time of its completion, it was one of the 5 fastest computers on Earth. Not in the Eastern Bloc, on Earth. Western intelligence agencies received reports about it and initially dismissed them as propaganda. Then they sent actual analysts to look at the data. The reports were accurate. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the Soviet computer program developed along its own trajectory. It was not perfect. Resources were always constrained, and the closed nature of Soviet society meant that engineers could not freely share or compare their work with the international scientific community. But they were building. They were innovating. The BESM-6, completed in 1967, could perform 1 million operations per second. That was not a rounding error in the global rankings. That was genuinely competitive hardware. And then came 1969, and the committee. And the decision that changed everything. The specific chain of events that led to that February meeting began in 1967, when the Soviet Ministry of Radio Industry initiated a quiet but furious internal debate. The question was simple and devastating. Should the Soviet Union continue developing its own computer architectures, or should it adopt IBM's system TART 360 as the standard platform and focus its engineering resources on cloning American hardware? On one side, Lebedev and the engineers. They argued that the Soviet computing tradition was viable, that independence from American architecture was not merely a matter of national pride, but a matter of national security. If the Soviet military, the Soviet space program, the Soviet nuclear command infrastructure, if all of it ran on cloned IBM hardware, what happened the moment the Americans changed their architecture? What happened when IBM introduced something genuinely new? The Soviets would be starting over, every time, forever. On the other side, the Ministry of Radio Industry, the party planners, and a significant faction of technology bureaucrats who had run the numbers on the cost of developing indigenous computing systems and decided it was simpler, far simpler, to copy what already worked. The engineers lost. In 1969, the Soviet government officially launched the Ryad program, from the Russian word for RAW, or series. The The Ryad computers would be functional clones of IBM System 360. Soviet factories would reverse engineer the hardware, Soviet programmers would rewrite the software, and Soviet research institutes would, from that point forward, spend the majority of their resources not on building the future, but on catching up to the present. What this meant in practice was brutal. IBM engineers in Armonk, New York, would design a new processor. Years later, after Soviet intelligence had obtained the technical specifications through a combination of legal purchases, industrial espionage, and the quiet cooperation of Western European technology firms that were not supposed to be selling to the Soviets but often did anyway, Soviet engineers would begin the process of reverse engineering it. They would build it. It would work. And by the time it reached Soviet factories in meaningful quantities, IBM had already moved on to something newer. The Soviets were, by structural design, always running in place. Lebedev continued to work. He was not arrested, not purged. This was 1969, not 1938. He simply lost the argument and returned to his laboratory. His team continued developing what would become the Elbrus architecture, a genuinely innovative Soviet computing design that in certain respects was architecturally ahead of its Western equivalents when finally completed. But the Elbrus was never given the industrial resources it needed to matter at scale. It remained a research project, a proof of concept, a monument to what could have been. Lebedev died in 1974, reportedly deeply disappointed by the direction Soviet computing had taken in his final years. There is a city northeast of Moscow called Zelenograd. In 1962, Nikita Khrushchev ordered its construction for a specific purpose. It would be the Soviet Silicon Valley. The Americans had their cluster of microelectronics companies forming around Stanford University in California. The Soviets would have Zelenograd, a planned city of research institutes and fabrication plants dedicated entirely to semiconductor development. The vision was real, the resources were real, and in the early 1960s, Zelenograd had access to something remarkable. Two American engineers who had been born, Philip Steros and Joel Barr, in New York, who had been part of the same communist intelligence network as Julius Rosenberg, and who had defected to the Soviet Union after Rosenberg's arrest. In the USSR, they went by new names. They brought with them deep expertise in American microelectronics that was years ahead of what Soviet engineers had independently developed. These men were obsessed with miniaturization. They understood, before most people in the world had articulated it clearly, that the future of computing was not in room-sized mainframes but in tiny chips. They designed miniaturized computers. They lobbied the Soviet military to adopt miniaturized electronics for missile guidance systems. They had a vision of where technology was heading that was, in retrospect, essentially correct. And they were blocked, repeatedly, by bureaucrats who didn't understand the technology, by military officials skeptical of miniaturization, by the institutional inertia of a system that rewarded caution and punished the kind of radical rethinking that Silicon Valley would soon reward with billions of dollars. One was eventually sidelined. The other died in 1979, his most important projects canceled or indefinitely delayed. The city of Zelenograd never became what Khrushchev imagined. It became instead a place where Soviet engineers worked very hard to reproduce things that American engineers had already stopped using. Meanwhile, in California, something completely different was happening. The Americans were not following a 5-year plan. They were not submitting proposals to a ministry. They were competing, viciously, relentlessly, with pure financial stakes, against each other. Fairchild Semiconductor had spawned Intel. Intel had spawned dozens of startups. Money flowed toward whatever worked. Ideas that failed were killed immediately, and resources redirected to ideas that didn't. Gordon Moore observed in 1965 that the number of transistors on a chip doubled approximately every 2 years. By the 1970s, that observation had become a self-fulfilling prophecy, driven by billions of dollars of competitive investment. The chips were getting smaller and faster than anyone, including the people making them, had fully anticipated. The Soviets could not match this, not because they lacked the mathematicians, not because they lacked the physicists. They couldn't match it because the system that allocated resources had no mechanism for rewarding success or punishing failure the way a competitive market does. Decisions were made by committees. Committees were made of people whose careers depended on not making visible mistakes. The result was systematic risk aversion at exactly the moment in history when the technology demanded systematic risk-taking. By 1980, the Soviet computer industry was running at least a decade behind the West, possibly more. And then Ronald Reagan became president of the United States and did something that the Soviets had not fully anticipated. He weaponized the technology gap. The existing restrictions on technology exports to the Soviet Union, which had been loosely enforced throughout the détente years of the 1970s, were suddenly enforced with genuine intensity. American allies were pressured to comply. The pipeline of Western technology components that Soviet engineers had been quietly relying on began to dry up. The effect on Soviet computing was severe. By the early 1980s, the Ryad cloning program had come to depend on obtaining actual IBM components, sometimes legally through front companies in neutral countries, sometimes through intelligence operations, because Soviet fabrication plants could not manufacture chips of equivalent quality domestically. When those chips became harder to obtain, the entire program slowed. Soviet military computers fell further behind. The guidance systems that were supposed to give the Red Army parity with NATO became dependent on smuggled microchips that were already outdated by the time they arrived in the factories that needed them. There is a remarkable CIA assessment from 1985, declassified in the 1990s, that described the Soviet microelectronics situation in terms the analysts clearly found almost unbelievable as they were writing them. The document noted that the Soviet Union was spending enormous resources, money, personnel, intelligence assets, to replicate technology that American companies had already moved beyond. That in some sectors, Soviet factories were producing chips equivalent to American chips from a decade earlier. That the military had begun to understand the depth of the gap and was alarmed by what it found. What that document described in the dry language of intelligence assessment was a civilization that had looked at the future and chosen, at a critical moment, to copy rather than create. And the consequences of that single choice had compounded over 16 years into something close to irreversible. The engineers who had argued against the Ryad decision in 1969 were never vindicated in any public way. There was no announcement, no official acknowledgement that the choice had been wrong. The Soviet system did not function that way. But by the mid-1980s, within the closed circles of Soviet technology policy, the debate had effectively been settled by reality. The indigenous computing tradition, Lebedev's tradition, the tradition of the BESM, the architecture that had produced one of the 5 fastest computers on Earth out of the rubble of the Second World War, had been strangled in a conference room, and what replaced it was a permanent structural dependency on an adversary's technology that could never be fully closed. Mikhail Gorbachev understood this when he came to power in 1985. One of the first things he did was commission a comprehensive assessment of Soviet technological competitiveness. The results were described by multiple accounts from people who saw them as deeply sobering, even by the standards of a system accustomed to receiving bad news. The assessment reportedly identified computing and microelectronics as the single greatest area of Soviet technological inferiority. Not nuclear weapons, not aerospace, not chemistry or biology. Computing. The thing that Lebedev had spent 30 years building from nothing. The thing that one committee had decided in 1969 was not worth building anymore. Gorbachev's response was glasnost and perestroika, an attempt to open and restructure a system that had, among its many failures, made it impossible for the truth about its own weaknesses to reach the people with the power to address them. Whether it was already too late by then is a question historians still argue about. What is not disputed is the trajectory. The technology gap between the Soviet Union and the United States, which had been manageable and perhaps even closable in 1969, was by 1989 a chasm wide enough to see from space. The Cold War ended for many reasons. Economic exhaustion, political delegitimization, the accumulated weight of decades of institutional failure. But somewhere in the accounting of why the Soviet Union lost, there is a line item that deserves more attention than it typically receives. In 1969, in a meeting room in Moscow, a committee of bureaucrats made a decision about computer architecture that one of the greatest engineers of the 20th century told them was wrong. He was right, and by the time everyone in power understood that he was right, there was no longer time to change it. The BESM-6 is in a museum now. Lebedev's papers are archived at the Russian Academy of Sciences. The Elbrus architecture, which his successors continued developing after his death, eventually produced a processor that Boris Babayan, one of Lebedev's own students, brought to Intel in 2004 when Intel acquired the team and the intellectual property that the Soviet system had never given sufficient resources to realize at scale. There is a particular kind of tragedy in that detail. The engineers who built the Soviet computing tradition were good enough that decades after the Soviet Union ceased to exist, an American corporation paid real money to acquire what they had created. They were not inferior. The system around them was. And understanding the difference between those two things, between the talent of the people and the constraints of the system they worked inside, is perhaps the most important lesson this story has to offer. The United States did not win the technology race of the Cold War because it had better mathematicians or more brilliant engineers. It won because it built a system that let brilliant people be wrong quickly, fail cheaply, and try again without asking a committee for permission. A system that moved resources toward success and away from failure in real time. The Soviets had the talent. They proved it in 1950, in 1952, in 1967. What they could not build was the environment in which that talent could compound on itself. Iteration after iteration, failure after failure, until it became something no 5-year plan could ever match. If you made it to the end of this one, you already know this channel isn't for everyone. It's for the people who want the part of the story that never made it into the history books. The decisions made in rooms no one was allowed to see by people whose names don't appear in textbooks that shaped the world we inherited. If that's you, subscribe, because the next story is going to be even harder to believe. And every word of it is true.